When we talk about current integration topics in the European Union, one that immediately came to my mind was terrorism being spread to small nations that otherwise might not experience terrorism, and especially with Islamic extremism. And as I will show in the rest of this presentation, you'll see that Denmark is a kind of a hotbed for this kind of activity. As you can see here, as we talk about Denmark's biography, it's very normal for a small European nation. It's got a 90% native population and over 90% Christian population, which makes it sort of a target for for Islamic extremism. And as you can see, the gross domestic product also puts it as a more wealthy nation in the world, being 8th in the world in GDP per capita. And it just sounds very ordinary for a small European nation that might not exactly expect Islamic terrorism. But on the 14th of February of this year in Copenhagen, there was a breakout with this gunman, Omar Abdal Hamid al-Hussein, who was 22 years old and Danish born and raised. He was often in trouble with Danish authorities, but he shares a lot of traits with the other Islamic extremists across Europe, especially those that are in Belgium and France. He also lived in the Nørrebro station, which is right here, right in the center of Copenhagen. There he is. I've got a little animation here. He killed 2 and wounded 5. He started by going over to the Krudendaten Cafe, where he shot many people, killing 1. And then at night, he attacked the night guard at the Copenhagen Jewish synagogue, where he also killed 1 of the night guard. He was cornered and killed by police in the street near the Nørrebro train station on a narrow street, and later died. So why is Denmark such a target for radical Islamicism? And this basically comes with the role of the European Union in the world stage. First off, of all the Western European nations, Denmark sends the second most fighters to extremist groups. Only Belgium sends more per capita than does Denmark. Now, Denmark follows something called the Aarhus model, which has been tried across Scandinavia, but is most renowned in Denmark itself. What happens in this Aarhus model is basically police try to socialize with people who are at risk to be Islamic extremists, and it tries to get them to reintegrate into society. But the issue with Scandinavia is that Scandinavia suffers from not having the fighters that re-enter society. And what happens here is in other nations, such as the UK and France, it has been where fighters that come back, say from fighting with ISIS, will come back and they will try to reintegrate them and then use them to talk to people who might be at risk. Well, in Scandinavia, these people that go away to be fighters don't necessarily come back in the numbers. And anyways, there is such a small number because of the population difference between, say, the UK and Denmark that this occurs. So now we're going to talk about regionalism, which plays a large role in this. Many Danes consider themselves to be European, and this idea of the European identity spreads the attention, whether it's good or bad, across Europe. Basically, to Islamic extremists, they see Denmark as just as much of a threat as Germany or the UK or France is to them. And it's this theory of a united Europe, as small nations are now seeing this sort of terrorism that wouldn't otherwise be something that they would even have to worry about. And then there's this thing, as I pointed in the second bullet point, the dominoes of support, is that because of the EU being dominated by the big 3 between the UK, France, and Germany, as one of them moves into a position, often the smaller nations will kind of fall behind, even if they necessarily don't want to, because they're tied in the EU with them. So thus, it looks to the Islamic extremists that Denmark is just playing as a helper aid to the policy that's being put in by the big 3. So here's with regionalism, and as I already point, and the other is this adoption of European identity. And the reason that a lot of Islamic extremists try to attack Europe necessarily is because of the dominant colonial past. As you can see in the map on the right, it shows that most of the Arab world was dominated by European powers during this time. And especially the UK and France were big players in this. And then the Christian history of Europe is another one that kind of often changes the way Islamic extremists look at Denmark. And this is also because of, well, the Crusades, which is the historic part, and the Spanish Inquisition, which was basically the Christians purifying themselves, sort of a way of trying to remove Muslims from territory, and now it's a kind of sort of a retaliation type impact. So as a result of regionalism, we can also tie this to the link with the United States, which is seen as the bully of the world, especially in the Middle East. So as we can see, that NATO involvement is led by the United States. And although the United States really has absolutely no impact on the European Union and integration itself, the historical ties between the European Union and the United States via NATO has created this interlink that basically is a signal towards Islamic extremists. So what you have here is that Denmark and the United States also have had this historically great relationship, which has been strengthened since post-World War I, but Denmark was one of the first nations to acknowledge American independence, and thus in 1801, ever since then, there has been standard diplomatic relations between the United States and Denmark, which even furthers the ties than what the EU is used to dealing with United States on defense issues. So the Danish military has been present in Afghanistan and in Iraq and in many of the other different NATO and EU peacekeeping missions across the world. And it's popular support by the Danish government to support American anti-terror policy, which along with many of its other EU partners also have the same feeling, especially those in the continental Europe. Not necessarily Scandinavia, but in continental Europe, the support for American anti-terror policy has linked the two together definitely. So what is the future for integration for Denmark and its national security? So a weakening integration is going to end up weakening Denmark's security. And Denmark is in a strong position as far as the small members of the EU because it is also a member of NATO. So basically, the European Union needs to strengthen support in defense for small nations. And the European Union has to look otherwise at successful policy to curb terrorism. Because the issue that I see, especially with the European Union and its terrorism efforts, is that the EU seems to be in the middle, where Islamic terrorists can kind of play the EU's struggle for integration and devolution at the same time. Because the EU is in that middle stage where it's not completely independent nations that really have true self-autonomy, but then it's not quite to the point where the EU is in more of a federalized structure where it can act as one. You have so many people sharing the power within the EU that it kind of opens itself up to where Islamic terrorists can see itself as being a way to strike fear within the EU. So that's basically it on Islamic terrorism in Denmark, and I hope that especially we can see that the integration for Denmark and other small EU nations is very critical in preventing terror attacks in the future.